Welcome to a new edition of System Update. I'm Glenn Greenwald. This episode explores what has become known as the debate over cancel culture, a debate that has often been vapid, distorted, and guided by people who have very little interest in what are actually the important causes and issues underlying the discussion. To begin with, let me make an observation about the term cancel culture itself, which is a term that I have come to loathe and often avoid using for many reasons, beginning with the fact that the term cancel culture has no precise meaning, no consistent meaning of any kind. In fact, in many ways, it reminds me of other similar terms that don't actually have any concise or precise definition and then are used frequently in our dialogue, such as terrorism and hate speech and fake news, terms that have no consistent definition and therefore can be wielded cynically and exploitatively by whoever happens to be having the power to use them at any given time. What does cancel culture even mean? Does it mean that powerful people who have prominent positions are criticized more aggressively and vociferously than they're accustomed to being criticized, or that make them comfortable? It certainly seems like oftentimes that's how the term is used. Or does it mean that powerless people are being sanctioned and punished to the point of having their reputations destroyed and their jobs taken away for transgressing in a minor way what are very new limits and how our discourse can function? A dynamic that is much more serious than the first case. It can mean any of those things and anything in between. And I think anytime that we have terms that have suddenly taken on great cachet and are defining and shaping our discourse, like cancel culture, that are without any definable meaning, it's always ripe for abuse, especially by those who wield the greatest power. And it just so happens to be that the latest outbreak of cancel culture discourse is being led by elites, people who have large platforms and great power, and therefore they're exploiting the fact that there's very little definitional precision to the term in order to distort and mislead what the discussion actually could be about and should be about in its most meaningful sense. There's another aspect of the term cancel culture that I strongly dislike, and for that reason have avoided using, which is the fact that it implies, just like the term fake news implied, that it's something brand new in this phenomenon. Fake news was introduced to suggest that for the first time ever, people in the population were being subjected in large numbers to systematically false propaganda and deliberately fake information designed to deceive them into believing one thing or another, when of course, ever since the printing press began, and even before that, power centers disseminating information that they knew to be false has always been a crucial means of controlling the way populations think and dictating their behavior. What is it that's new about fake news? What is the definition of fake news that describes it as a novel pathology, other than the fact that suddenly people in power felt like it was being used against them rather than for them, and therefore wanted to create new terminology in order to get a hold of it? I see very much the same thing with this term cancel culture. Of course, it's always been the case in every society, including our own, that there are ideas that are so off limits, that are deemed shameful, that are deemed wrong, that the mere expression of them can result not necessarily in prison, although sometimes that, but oftentimes worse punishments, like complete social scorning to the point of being entirely unemployable. There's nothing new about what's being called cancel culture, and therefore to discuss it as though it's something that's just suddenly an outbreak after the George Floyd murder or with the advent of social media is something that I think is extremely misleading. What makes it even more disturbing for me is that the discussion is being led almost entirely by very powerful and influential writers and journalists and activists, people who have very significant platforms, people like J.K. Rowling, people like George Packer and David Frum and others like them, who are essentially invulnerable to whatever we might want to call cancellation. And that is creating the perception, the not inaccurate perception, that the grievance that has arisen in the name of protesting cancel culture is little more than elites angry about the fact in a very whiny way that for the first time they're hearing from what they're calling the mob critiques of their work. 20 years ago, if you wrote for a large magazine like The Atlantic or had a column in the New York Times or wrote books sponsored by the largest corporate publishing houses, you almost never heard from your critics. People in your social circles heaped praised on you. The most that would ever happen is some letter to the editor would be written to the newspaper that you worked at that nobody would ever read except to laugh at, that would be published on the last page of the section that nobody would care about. That was the extent of the critiques that you heard, especially from the unadorned mob. And now suddenly social media has empowered huge numbers of people that many elites regard as unqualified to criticize them, to have a voice in criticizing them. And that has created the perception, because these are the people in the lead complaining about cancel culture, people who aren't vulnerable to losing their jobs or livelihood, who are very, very safe in their economic security and their reputational security and their job security, people like J.K. Rowling, the billionaire, and many others. It creates the perception that this is nothing more than petulant, whiny concerns over loss of elite status, and to some extent, that is what it is. The problem is there's a lot more to it than that. There are actually deep and abiding and profound problems that are arising as a result of the radical changes in how our discourse functions that affect not the powerful people, but those without power. And I think the problem has been that because of the people who have taken the lead in these discussions, the way in which they framed it, the way in which they've exploited a term, cancel culture that has very little definition, it has obscured and hidden and distorted the very real harms that are coming, not to powerful people, but to powerless ones, as a result of these profound and radical changes in our discourse that very few people have the capacity or the willingness or the courage, because of their career position, in order to question or challenge. And I want to spend a little bit of time talking about what I think are some of those genuinely serious and substantive problems, as opposed to the artificial elite concern whiny ones that have received most of the attention that are being generated by this latest outbreak of how the discourse is changing. Now, part of my effort to focus on what I think are the actual profound and significant developments from the changes in our discourse, as opposed to the examples of elite whining over their loss of privilege, over the fact that they now have to hear criticisms, is part of the impetus that caused me to write a 7,000-word article about my experiences in trying to make a film about Martina Navratilova over the last 2 years, and the various episodes of true cancel culture in the way that I understand them, that shape the film and help impede the production and making of it, just to try and foster a discussion of how it can actually be understood beyond elite whining about loss of privilege. But one point I think is really crucial to make is that none of this is new. I began writing about politics in 2005. Before that, I was a constitutional lawyer. And I remember that at the time I began writing, it was at the point when blogs were finally starting to exert true influence over the discourse, to be able to meaningfully critique mainstream journalists in a way that they could no longer ignore. And it caused a huge cultural uproar. Journalists at the New York Times and the Washington Post and NBC News hated blogs. They were extremely resentful over the idea that people with what they regarded as no competence in journalism, no training in how newsrooms work, had the ability now to be heard and to critique the work of these professional journalists. This was supposed to be something that was extremely upsetting to how status ought to work. And so the idea that people who have platforms and privileges and power hate having newcomers to their world, outsiders to their world, finally be able to have a voice that penetrates their world is by no means something that's new. That was the conflict that shaped how journalists scorned and tried to disqualify bloggers of whom I was certainly a part at the time, and I remember it very well. And this is just a repeat of that level of cancer culture protestation by many of the signers, for example, of the Harper's letter, who have never experienced any repercussions of any kind in their life, and yet who are simply whining about the fact that now suddenly they have to hear criticism. For sure, that is a part, but only a part of what is taking place. Now, earlier this week, in an effort to try and clarify the discussion and to deepen it, I asked on Twitter, for those of you using this term, what is the definition of cancel culture? What does it mean? Not how is it manifesting in particular cases that you could point to, because everybody has different cases where they think it does or doesn't apply, but what is the actual definition? And one of the only people who responded was the evolutionary psychologist Jeffrey Miller, who told me that it does in fact have a fixed definition. And this is how he defined the term. Quote, cancel culture has a clear meaning, he told me. It's a social system of ideological control in which online mobs are roused by outrage to appeal to authorities, governments, employers, mass media, to ruin someone's life because they've said something, quote, offensive. Okay, that is an actual concrete definition that you can work with. There have been 2 cases this week that would meet that definition. One is that the head writer of the Tucker Carlson show, Blake Neff, was found to have been posting online extremely grotesquely racist and sexist commentary under a pseudonym. And when it was discovered, people demanded that Fox News take action against him, and Fox News did. They fired him. That fits perfectly into Miller's definition of cancel culture, when online mobs are roused to appeal to authorities, such as employers, to ruin someone's life because they've said something offensive. The same is true of the news this morning that CBS fired Nick Cannon for having made what are blatantly anti-Semitic remarks that caused indignation over social media, that pressured CBS to sever ties with him. Are those examples of unjust, repressive cancel culture? Are people denouncing cancel culture angry that Blake Neff was fired by Fox and that Nick Cannon was fired by CBS? I think there'd be nobody who would say that that was something wrong, even though it perfectly meets Professor Miller's definition of cancel culture. And this underscores the key point to me. It has always been the case, and it will always be the case, that society has pieties and orthodoxies. And one of those ways that society enforces those pieties and orthodoxies is by isolating and punishing and scorning those who deviate from them. It's always been the case that it's hard to get a job if you're publicly expressing opinions and views that the vast majority of the society regards as repellent. I'm not even sure that anyone can argue that's a bad thing, but whether it's bad or not, it's certainly not something new. So what we have to realize when we talk about cancel culture is we're not talking about a new phenomenon. We're talking about something that has always existed and will always exist. And even with the advent of social media, maybe it has changed the kinds of people and the number of people who have input into what is now on the list of ideas that are deemed repellent by society, that are deemed outside of the orthodoxy. And maybe that's a good thing, since it's democratized the people who have input into that, rather than confining it to a small group of homogenized power brokers who in the past were always the ones who got to determine that. In fact, that was one of always the promises of the internet, was that it would democratize and make more egalitarian our discourse by empowering people who never previously were empowered because they didn't have access to TV networks or to newspapers. That seems to be the big change. Not that there used to never be a cancel culture and now that there is, but the change is that who gets to participate and what the contours of cancel culture now are. And so the question is not, is cancel culture good or is it bad? Because it's always existed and always will. You can never get rid of it. The question is is the way in which cancel culture is manifesting now, are the radical changes that it's undergoing in the wake of the George Floyd murder and the Black Lives Matter movement and other societal changes, positive in the sense that it is reinforcing the taboo on ideas that ought to be deemed so shameful and scornful that people ought to lose all opportunities to participate in decent society? Or is it becoming excessive? Is it becoming repressive? That is the ultimate question. And the question is not, is it becoming excessive and repressive for rich, famous people with huge journalistic platforms or literary platforms who are already very protected? The question is it becoming repressive and excessive for ordinary people, for workers who work inside corporations who are being indoctrinated with new philosophies about how discourse functions and who have no protection, who have no recourse, and who either have two choices: obey the new dictates or suffer the consequences of job loss and shame, with no one to protect them, no one who will appeal on their behalf, or to simply self-censor and say nothing at all. We have to define what the contours of the debate actually are, and the fact that it's been led by people who really aren't victims of it has radically distorted what this debate at its most important core really is and should be about. Now, one of the distortive points that often gets made as part of this discussion is that free speech doesn't really apply to what we're calling cancel culture, because free speech is only implicated in the First Amendment by the government punishing people, imprisoning people, or fining people, or sanctioning them for ideas the government has declared off limits. And that's true in the most technical, legalistic, and constricted way of speaking. There are some examples and some calls for the government to start punishing hate speech. But in general, it is true that what we're talking about is not generally the type of free speech implicated by the constitutional right of a First Amendment, which guarantees free speech and protection from government punishment for expressing ideas. But free speech doesn't just have this constricted, cramped, legalistic meaning. It also is a value, a liberal value since the Enlightenment, about the need for human beings to have latitude to express ideas that are wrong, in part because that's how debate and discussion and learning happen, but also in recognition from the Enlightenment that one of the worst parts of history was believing that human beings had the capacity to propound authoritative, definitive truth that was the expression of ultimate truth, unchallengeable truth, that there's no such thing as the ability of human beings, whether it's the Vatican or monarchs, to propound truths that can no longer be subject to debate because they're so indisputably right. And so when we talk about illiberalism and liberalism as values, free speech outside of the constitutional right of legalism is a crucial defining value, the ability to have open, vibrant discourse about ideas without suffering punishment. Now, one of the really ironic parts of the debate since the cancel culture wars re-erupted in the wake of the George Floyd murder was that I've seen very often people on the left saying that, oh, look, there's a leftist solution to this problem of people being fired from their jobs for having expressed opinions that the employer disliked. People like David Shore, the classic case that everyone has agreed is unjust because he was fired for having cited academic research by an African-American scholar at Princeton over whether or not violent or nonviolent protests are better for the civil rights movement and other movements, and he concluded that nonviolent protests work better. He cited that. It was deemed to be critical of the Black Lives Matter movement. He was therefore fired. The solution I heard from a lot of people on the left was, look, the solution is just get rid of at-will employment, the ability of employers to fire people, workers, for any reason at all, and prohibit them from firing people for the opinions that they express. Is that really something people want to do? Because if you think about it, that would mean that Fox News would have been prohibited from firing Blake Neff for the having expressed extremely racist and misogynistic ideas. It would have meant that CBS would have been prohibited from severing ties with Nick Cannon for his anti-Semitic remarks. Of course, private corporations have the right of free association and not to associate with people expressing ideas that are repellent. The question is, are we being too restrictive in what that means, or are we being too extreme in how we're constricting what are the respectable range of debates? Now, there's no question that free speech as a value is restricted, not merely by the government imprisoning you for the things that you say, but also for your inability to work if you hold certain positions. One of the best essays on this, and one that illustrates how long these debates have been going on, how unnew they are, was a 1922 essay by the brilliant British atheist Bertrand Russell, who talked in this long essay not only about all the social sanction and career loss of opportunities that he suffered by virtue of being an atheist in Christian England, but also he was very worried about, even though he was not an adherent to communism, the similar repression that communists in the United States and throughout Western Europe were experiencing. And one of the points he made was that oftentimes the worst way that free discourse and the best sense of the Enlightenment is restricted is not through state sanction of punishing people, but through social scorn that makes it impossible to have a career or have your reputation in any working order because you're expressing views that deviate from orthodoxies that often future generations come to regard not just as wrong, but as immoral. Here's what he wrote, quote, "Legal penalties are, however, in the modern world, the least of the obstacles to freedom of thought. The two great obstacles are economic penalties and distortion of evidence. It is clear that thought is not free if the profession of certain opinions makes it impossible to earn a living. It is clear also that thought is not free if the arguments on one side to a controversy are perpetually presented as attractively as possible, while arguments on the other side can only be discovered by diligent search." That's a really important point. If the only way that you can keep a job, especially if you're somebody who's just an ordinary worker in a contracting economy, someone who's a young journalist who doesn't have a big platform, watching media jobs disappear, is by affirming orthodoxies and never questioning them, that is a severe constriction on free speech, even if the government isn't picking you up in a police car and imprisoning you. And this is one of my main worries in terms of what's happening in journalism. I remember throughout the last 4 years of Russiagate, when in CNN and MSNBC and the Washington Post and the New York Times, the overwhelming orthodoxy was Russiagate was one of the worst scandals ever. It was obvious that Trump and Russia had colluded. And those of us who were expressing skepticism because we had the freedom to do so because we weren't dependent on those institutions, I know personally I was constantly hearing from young journalists inside all of those outlets thanking me for expressing that dissidence, talking about how oppressive the environment was in a corporation. Think about if you're a young journalist watching jobs disappear, the last thing you're ever going to want to do is stick your head up and question or challenge any media piety because you know it'll destroy your ability to feed your family and have a career. In journalism especially, there are fields where free discourse is more important than others. Journalism is one and academia is the other. In those fields, if people feel completely unfree to question orthodoxies or to question pieties because they know it'll destroy their career, they'll be ruined and their reputation shattered in one day over social media, think how much we're losing as a society from the benefits of free discourse, from the ability of society to question pieties and orthodoxies that in one generation are regarded as so sacred they can't be challenged, but in the next generation they're regarded as shameful and morally wrong. That's the evolution of human knowledge. No human being should be trusted with the ability to propound truths with such certainty that questioning or dissenting from them ought to be prohibited. That is the nub of the debate, not necessarily for people with power and status who can do that with ease, such as myself, but people who cannot because they don't have the status and that protection. You'll find two things about the people who are saying things like, oh, there's no such thing as cancel culture. It's just an isolated case here and there, just invented. Number one, they agree with the prevailing orthodoxies. They have no interest in dissenting from the prevailing orthodoxies. They don't question the prevailing orthodoxies. And therefore, of course, they feel very safe and think that nothing is wrong because they're proselytizers and believers in the dominant religion. So they don't have the experience of ever dissenting. That's one thing that you have to notice about them. It's only the dissenters who are concerned about this, not the people who are fully on board with the new prevailing orthodoxies. But the other aspect of it, the other part of it, of the people who are saying, oh, there's no such thing as cancel culture, these people, I'm sorry to say, just aren't telling the truth. Anybody who works in a newsroom, anybody who works in a think tank, anybody who works in a corporation, I'm positive has seen radical changes. They're bringing in diversity consultants like Robin DiAngelo and her followers to instruct people about the new language, about the new way of thinking, about the new way of communicating, about the new way of repenting, about the new way. It's a whole new civic religion that is being introduced, and people are being told in workplaces that they're forced to abide by them if they want to keep their jobs. These are profound and radical changes in how we're permitted to communicate with one another. And if you don't want to call that cancel culture, call it whatever you want, but at least have the honesty to recognize that these changes are very significant and very profound. And even if you like those changes, at least admit that there are other people whose freedom of thought and freedom of discourse is being constricted by them. I just want to give you one example that happens to come from my own newsroom. Not because I want to gossip about what's taking place in my own newsroom. I don't. It's because it's already been reported in the New York Times, and it's highly illustrative of what's happening in newsrooms. In newsrooms where journalistic freedom and editorial independence and free thought have to thrive at least as importantly as in academia, where there's now internecine wars in almost every newsroom over whether free speech should continue to be a predominant value or whether it ought to give way to a new ideology. Let me just quote from an article in the New York Times by Ben Smith, who apparently was leaked some internal communications at The Intercept that really give the contours for what these debates are. And again, it's by no means only happening at The Intercept. It's in every newsroom. Talk to anybody and they'll tell you the same thing. This is what Ben Smith a few weeks ago wrote, quote, "At The Intercept, founded in 2014 by radical believers in free expression, the union's diversity subcommittee challenged that central priority in an email to management. Quote, free speech is an important principle at The Intercept, but union members are concerned that this commitment to free speech has distracted from a commitment to anti-racism in our coverage and in our workplace. Meaning, yes, free speech matters, but it doesn't matter so much that sometimes it can't give way to other more important ideological agenda items that are political in nature." The article went on, it said the editor-in-chief, Betsy Reed, questioned that suggestion and wrote in response that, quote, "We should also consider the question of whether in the name of anti-racism, there has been pressure to suppress non-racist ideas that do not align with the dominant view of how the movement should seek to achieve its aims or what those aims should be," meaning that there's an ongoing campaign in journalism and academia to deem any ideas that deviate from the prevailing orthodoxy, no matter how slightly and well-intentioned, as being so racist, so bigoted, so hateful, that they need to be banned in the name of these values that are now to be venerated more than free speech, even in those venues that society needs free speech and free discourse most to flourish, like academic institutions and in journalistic newsrooms. Anyone who tells you that these changes aren't taking place is not telling you the truth, because it's taking place in the very places they work. They may like the changes. They may not feel personally threatened by them because they're on board with the orthodoxies, but they certainly know that they're happening. There's a huge profitable industry of diversity consultants being brought in by all of these corporations out of fear of legal liability to indoctrinate and teach their employees how to behave in a way that doesn't give liability to these new entities that are all about indoctrinating people how to think differently, how to speak differently, how to interact with one another differently. And it's very reflective by the books on the top of the New York Times bestseller list, such as White Fragility. And anyone who tells you that these aren't fundamental radical changes is being far less than honest. Now, I just want to conclude with 2 points that I think can be helpful in trying to not just better understand in a more precise way what this debate is, but also towards trying to reach some harmony and resolution in how we talk about it. The first is to recognize, as I said earlier, that there's nothing new about this debate. I myself have been writing about what you might want to call cancel culture since the beginning of my career as a journalism 15 years ago, and even before that as a lawyer. The difference is that the canceling was being done not to the people now complaining about it in the Harper's letter, but by them. It's now well known that people like Bari Weiss, who's the new martyr of free speech and cancel culture, spent her college years trying to prevent Arab and Muslim professors and academics and scholars from getting tenure and trying to destroy their reputation for the crime of criticizing Israel. I've written repeatedly about how the primary victims on college campuses are not right-wing students, despite the overwhelming media emphasis on them, but Palestinian students, pro-Palestinian activists, people who are advocates of the boycott and divestment and sanction movement around the West, not just on American campuses. They're often being criminalized on the grounds that activism against Israel is a form of anti-Semitism and therefore can be banned under hate speech laws or even sanctioned with criminal prosecution. So this has been going on for a long time. The problem has been that the victims of it are people without voices, and the perpetrators are the ones who are most powerful. What has changed is not the dynamic, but who's now able to perpetrate it and who's now able to feel the pressure from it. So the solution isn't to take the injustices that have been perpetrated for so long and pick up those weapons and now use it against the people who have been the perpetrators. That just doubles the injustice. The solution is to find a way to end this unjust repression. And the way to do that is to ask people who are currently protesting the advent of what they're calling cancel culture to examine their conscience, look in their own past to see how often they've demonized and attempted to destroy their reputations of, or even to get fired or impede the career advancement of people who expressed opinions that they themselves hated, often Muslims and leftists, obviously communists throughout the history of the United States, critics of Israel. Because if you're not willing to do that, if you're a signer of the Harper's letter who's going to pretend that there's nothing in your past that reflects the pathologies and evils that you're now denouncing, you deserve to have no credibility. You deserve to have your letter scoffed at and laughed at and dismissed rather than taken seriously, because that letter doesn't contain principles, meaning things that you're willing to apply in all cases. It just contains arms, instruments that you want to use to protect yourself and to continue your right to oppress others. So that's the first thing that has to happen. The people who are signatories to that Harper's letter and those who sympathize with them need to grapple with what they've done in their past and to ask whether they're guilty of the same things they're now accusing their critics of doing, because they are. It's been going on for decades. The only difference is that social media and other social changes have simply shifted who now has the power to do it. But if we oppose it on principle in all cases, that is one way to combat it. The other way is through the characteristic that, for me, lies at the heart of my advocacy of free speech for decades, going back to when I was a lawyer and also for my years as a journalist, which is the idea of humility. And I can already hear people saying, humility is not a term I associate with you, Glenn Greenwald. You don't seem particularly humble to me in your advocacy. And yes, it's true. I hold views very passionately. I have a lot of views that I think are clearly correct and don't see a reasonable opposition to. What I mean by humility is not bowing your head and refusing to be passionate about your causes and aggressive in your advocacy of them. What I mean is a recognition that as all human beings, we're not just capable of erring, but that we err constantly. And therefore, we should never have the confidence in any human beings and in any human institutions, and most of all in ourselves, to formulate ideas and opinions that are so objectively and unquestionably correct for all of history that we should be confident banning or punishing or sanctioning the ability of other people to question them. That's why I believe in free speech. Not because I don't think there are ideas that are clearly correct and should be protected and venerated as such, but because I don't trust any human institutions or any human beings to decree with certainty that they're inerrant. That was the pre-Enlightenment method of authority. That the Pope issues encyclicals and other pronouncements that no one has the right to challenge or question because by definition they're inerrant. The same with monarchs. The idea of the Enlightenment, the core idea of the Enlightenment, where liberalism comes from, is the recognition that we're always going to be erring as human beings, that human knowledge will never be fixed but always evolving, and that can happen only if we retain the right of people to be able to question and debate and challenge pieties and orthodoxies without being punished not just by the state, but by what Bertrand Russell called the loss of livelihood. And let me just read, to conclude, his own tribute to the virtue of humility and how this all functions for the importance of free discourse. This is what he said in 1922, quote, "William James used to preach the, quote, will to believe. For my part, I should wish to preach the, quote, will to doubt. None of our beliefs is quite true. All have at least a penumbra of vagueness and error. The methods of increasing the degrees of truth in our beliefs are well known. They consist in hearing all sides, trying to ascertain all the relevant facts, controlling our own bias by discussion with people who have the opposite bias, and cultivating a readiness to discard any hypothesis which is proved inadequate. These methods are practiced in science and have built up the body of scientific knowledge. Every man of science whose outlook is truly scientific is ready to admit that what passes for scientific knowledge at the moment is sure to require correction with the progress of discovery. Nevertheless, it is near enough to the truth to serve for most practical purpose, though not for all. In science, where alone something approximating the general knowledge is to be found, men's attitude is tentative and full of doubt. In religion and politics, on the contrary, though there is as yet nothing approaching scientific knowledge, everybody considers it de rigueur to have a dogmatic opinion, to be backed up by inflicting starvation, prison, and war, and to be carefully guarded from argumentative competition with any different opinion. If only men could be brought into a tentatively agnostic frame of mind about these matters, 9/10 of the evil of the modern world would be cured. War would become impossible because each side would realize that both sides must be in the wrong. Persecution would cease. Education would be aimed at expanding the mind, not at narrowing it. Men would be chosen for jobs on account of fitness to do the work, not because they flattered the irrational dogma of those in power. Thus, rational doubt alone, if it could be generated, would suffice to introduce the millennial. I think the fact that social media is where so many of our arguments play out, and it's designed to do the opposite of what Bertrand Russell urges, where we're kind of like gladiators in a ring fighting for our survival of our future opportunities, of our reputation. The incentives have never been lower to be agnostic about anything, to admit the possibility of doubt, to concede anything to our adversaries. And that's the reason why our discourse is degrading to such an extent where intolerance of dissenting views is increasing, where the virtues of never speaking to people who are different than you, who have different views than you, has never been higher. And all of this is only going to continue. Society will only get sicker until we can return to this model of recognizing first and foremost in ourselves and then in others that being human means always erring, and therefore being humble about our beliefs rather than dogmatic about them and eager to punish those who deviate. That, to me, is what, if you want to call it cancel culture, the debate is about. Not the whiny entitlement of famous writers and authors who want to be shielded from criticism, which is certainly an example many people are exhibiting. The much deeper one is that people who are powerless, the society in general, need the space to have this kind of dialogue, to resolve our differences. And the new repressive atmosphere being evangelized in workplaces and academic institutions, in political factions and online is suffocating and constricting that space more than ever. And all that can produce is more acrimony, more conflict, more error, and more war. I hope you enjoyed listening, and I hope this has been helpful, and I hope you'll read the lengthy article that I wrote this week, to which I devoted most of my energy this week, to my discussion of my experience in trying to make a film about Martina Navratilova, which explores these issues even further by offering some concrete examples that I personally witnessed. Thanks very much.